Okay, so when you hear American witch trials, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Salem, right? Of course. But what if I told you that whole story, the fear, the accusations, the trials, it all started decades earlier? That's what we're going to dig into today. We're going to unpack the story of a witch hunt that happened long before Salem to really understand the anatomy of how these panics get started.
Yeah, this isn't a line from some horror movie. This is a real indictment. And look at that date, 1657. The charge? Basically being friends with Satan. And the penalty? Death. Just wow. So where did this happen? Not Salem. This was East Hampton, Long Island, in 1657. So what was really going on here? That is the big question for this explainer. We're going to peel back the layers of one of America's earliest witch trials to get at the social, the political, and the religious forces that could turn your neighbor into a monster. And this was 35 years before Salem even happened.
All right, let's start with the accused herself, Elizabeth Garlick. She was a resident of East Hampton, and in the winter of 1657, a whole string of bizarre and frankly terrifying events would put her life on the line. So listen to the testimony from her neighbors, because it is chilling. A dying woman claimed she saw a black thing at the foot of her bed, but, and here's the kicker, only when someone mentioned Garlick's name. Then you have babies getting sick. One even died right after their mother's milk just vanished. And on top of that, livestock are dropping dead. In their minds, this was what they called maleficium, harmful magic. And every single finger was pointing at one person. So why her? Why Elizabeth? Was she really out there communing with dark forces, or did she just fit a very specific and very dangerous profile? To figure that out, we have to understand what it even meant to be a witch in the eyes of her Puritan community. And it turns out there was a tragically consistent type of person who ended up in the crosshairs. You see, the witch wasn't just some random choice. She was almost always a woman who stood out in ways that made her community deeply uncomfortable. Okay, take a good look at this profile. It paints a really specific picture, right? We see she's female, middle-aged, often without a husband or son to protect her. But look closer at these other points. Contentious or assertive, discontent with her lot in life. I mean, these aren't descriptions of some satanic evil. They're describing a woman who didn't conform, who didn't fit neatly into this super rigid social box. And this is where it gets really fascinating, the money angle. It wasn't always as simple as, the rich pointing fingers at the poor. Historian Carol Carlson makes this incredible argument that it often targeted women who, maybe through widowhood or not having sons, stood to inherit property. That was a huge threat to the male-dominated system. So it wasn't just about being poor. It was about being economically vulnerable or a threat to the status quo. Okay, and here's a crucial point. These accusations didn't just pop up out of nowhere. They were like explosions that happened when the entire society was living under immense, prolonged stress. It was a pressure cooker. I mean, just look at this timeline. For half a century, the colonists were basically in a pressure cooker. First, the English Civil War kicks off. That cuts off supplies, and you know what else it does? It floods the colonies with witch-hunting propaganda from back home. Then you've got war with the Dutch, which means constant fear on the frontier. And then the absolute devastation of King Philip's War, which created trauma on a scale that's hard for us to even imagine. 1 in 16. Let that sink in for a second. During King Philip's War, 1 out of every 16 men of fighting age in the colonies died. Can you imagine the level of collective grief and fear and just trauma that leaves on a society? So when your world feels like it's literally collapsing, when you're just surrounded by death and uncertainty, it is so much easier psychologically to find a villain in your own village than it is to accept that the world is just chaotic and violent. But why a witch, right? Of all things, why was that the specific answer to their fear? Well, to get that, we have to really step inside the Puritan worldview, where a real cosmic battle was being waged for their souls every single day. For the average person on the street, the fear was all about maleficium. Think of this as witchcraft from the ground up. It's the belief that your spiteful neighbor could use some kind of supernatural power to ruin your crops, kill your animals, or make your child sick. It was tangible, it was personal, and it was absolutely terrifying.
And here's the critical disconnect. You got to understand this. The villagers, they're terrified of spoiled milk and sick cattle. That's the maleficium. But for the court, for the magistrates, that wasn't enough. No way. They needed to prove a pact, a deal with the devil. So what they did was they took those everyday fears and used them as evidence for a much bigger theological crime, a betrayal of God himself. And you have to remember, in their minds, this wasn't just paranoia. They truly believed they were building a godly New Jerusalem on land that had, for centuries, belonged to the devil. So every single hardship, from wars with Native Americans to religious dissenters like the Quakers, was seen as Satan trying to reclaim his territory. Okay, so let's bring it all back to Elizabeth Garlick. With all this context in mind, the fear, the politics, the religion, what happened to her? And what does her story ultimately tell us about the nature of a witch hunt? Well, believe it or not, she was acquitted. The governor, a man named John Winthrop Jr., basically looked at the evidence and said, nope, not enough here to prove a pact with the devil. But, and this is a big but, it wasn't a clean break. Her husband still had to post a massive 20-pound bond, a fortune back then, just to guarantee her future good behavior.
So her case gives us this perfect blueprint, the anatomy of a witch hunt. And it's laid out right here. Step 1, a society under extreme, prolonged stress. Step 2, a pre-existing belief system that provides a ready-made enemy. Step 3, a vulnerable person who fits the type is identified as the scapegoat. And finally, step 4, everyday neighborhood fears and quarrels blow up into an official, deadly accusation.
So at the end of the day, the ultimate takeaway is this. Witch hunts aren't just about superstition or some random hysteria. They're a symptom of a society in deep crisis. It's a tragic, desperate attempt to create order and certainty in a world that feels completely out of control. And that leaves us with a final, kind of chilling question, doesn't it? The specific accusations of witchcraft, the pacts with the devil, that might belong to the past. But that underlying pattern of a society under stress that starts looking for a villain to blame for all its problems, that is a powerful and timeless lesson. It's a pattern we see repeated throughout history, and it's something we should probably all be mindful of today. Thanks for joining this explainer.